They say Iowa is empty, but that's only if you believe nothing is watching you back. Wind moves through endless cornfields, dry stalk shifting in slow waves. Something out there, something crunches through the rows. Heavy, deliberate footsteps where nothing should be walking. Step. Pause. Step. It's getting closer. A distorted voice breaks through, like a recording pulled from a damaged tape. It had wings, and it wasn't supposed to be there. Then silence. Just wind again. But it doesn't feel the same anymore. It feels distant, like the island itself is holding its breath. Out here, the fields don't stay empty for long, and they don't forget what happens in them. Tonight, we go to Iowa, where the fields don't forget, and some things were never meant to be buried. Welcome back to Hexes, Haunts, and Howls. I'm your host, Cupcake. Today is episode 15 of A through Z of Haunted America, a series where we explore the strange, eerie, and mysterious corners of America. Tonight's episode takes us into the heart of the Midwest, Iowa, a state most people think of as quiet. Flat roads, open skies, endless fields that seem to stretch further than memory. But Iowa has a different reputation once you start listening to the stories people don't usually say out loud. Quiet state, loud history. Most people pass through Iowa without ever stopping long enough to notice what's underneath it. And that's where tonight begins. Because beneath those cornfields and small towns, there are stories that refuse to stay buried. A winged entity seen drifting over rooftops in the dead of night. A statue said to bring misfortune to anyone who gets close. And a murder house that never really went quiet, even after more than a century. Tonight, we're not just looking at Iowa's history, we're listening to what it left behind. Van Meter, Iowa, 1903. A small mining town where nights were usually quiet. The kind of quiet you expect from a place where everyone knows everyone, and nothing much ever changes. Until something started appearing above the rooftops. At first, it was just a light. A glowing shape hanging in the sky where nothing should have been. Too steady to be lighting, too deliberate to be a trick of reflection. It didn't flicker like fireflies or lanterns. It hovered. And then the people started noticing the shape behind it. Not just the light, but something inside it. A figure that looked vaguely human, but not quite right. Too small, too still. Wrong in the way it moved. Like it wasn't fully bound to the rules of weight or balance. Witnesses described wings, not feathers, not anything familiar, more like leather stretched too tight over something unnatural. Bat-like, heavy and silent. And above it all, a horn, or maybe a second light rising from its head. Something that didn't belong on anything from this world. The first few sightings were dismissed as imagination. Rumors spreading faster than the truth ever could in a small town. But then, it came back. Again and again. Each night, it appeared in a slightly different place, always just long enough to be seen, never long enough to be caught. That changed when people stopped pretending it wasn't real. Rifles were brought out. Men gathered in the streets and along the edges of town, waiting in the dark, watching the sky like it owed them answers. And then it came back again. This time, they fired. Shots crackled through the night, echoing across the town and into the fields beyond. Muzzle flashes lit up the rooftops, but the creature didn't react the way anything living should. It didn't fall. It didn't flee in panic. It simply remained, as if the bullets didn't matter at all. And then there were the details people couldn't explain afterward. A faint sulfur smell hanging in the air after each appearance. Sharp and unnatural, like something burned, but not quite fire. Animals refusing to settle. Horses panicking before it even arrived, as if they sensed it before humans ever could. And the most repeated word from witnesses wasn't fear, it was wrongness. Not danger, not monster, just wrong. Like reality itself had briefly misfired in that stretch of the Iowa sky. One witness later described it like this: it wasn't just seen, it was encountered, like it chose to be there. And just as simply as it started, it stopped. No final appearance, no dramatic departure, no explanation. It simply never returned, as if it had only ever been passing through. The tone shifts here. The wind from Iowa's open fields doesn't feel as wide anymore. The silence tightens. The sound design pulls inward. This is no longer a story about something seen in the distance. This is a story about what happens inside a house when something goes terribly wrong and never leaves. Villisca, Iowa, 1912. A normal small town, the kind where doors stayed unlocked and people trusted their neighbors. Until one night changed everything. 8 people were murdered. 6 of them were children, killed in their sleep with an axe. There was no sign of forced entry, no clear struggle that made sense of how it happened, no immediate suspect that held up under scrutiny, and eventually, no conviction at all. Just questions that never settled. The next morning, the house was discovered in the stillness that witnesses later struggled to describe. Not just quiet, but wrong quiet. The kind that makes sound feel like it's been removed from a space entirely. Rooms where life should have been happening the night before were frozen in something heavier than silence. Investigators arrived to a scene that didn't behave like a crime scene they could easily categorize. Everything felt off in a way no report could fully capture. Not just what was seen, but what wasn't. How quickly it all felt contained, almost staged, almost paused. And then the details began to settle in. The positioning of the bodies, the locked doors, the lack of disturbance in places that should have felt and shown chaos. The unanswered questions that kept stacking without resolution. Even then, the case didn't close in the way people expected. It lingered. And over time, the house itself became something else entirely in the public imagination. Because years after the murders, people started reporting things that didn't belong to history anymore. Children's voices where there should be none. Footsteps moving across the upstairs floor when no one is inside. Doors closing on their own, slow and deliberate, as if someone is still moving through the rooms. a rocking chair that shifts without explanation, and sudden pressure changes in certain spaces of the house, like the air itself becomes more aware that you are there. Paranormal investigators have come and gone for decades. Some stay overnight. Some bring equipment meant to measure what can't be seen. Recordings pick up sound no one can fully account for, and yet nothing ever resolves cleanly into proof or denial. Just more questions. And a feeling that refuses to leave once you've been inside. Because places like this don't feel haunted because of ghosts. They feel haunted because something wrong happened here and never left. And that's the part that sticks. Not the story of the crime itself, but the way the house still behaves like it's waiting for something to finish. Like it never accepted that the night ended. Some houses don't age. They wait. By the time you reach Iowa City, the story doesn't feel like it belongs to a single moment anymore. It feels layered, like memory built on top of memory. Inside Oakland Cemetery, there is a figure that draws people in long before they understand why. A large bronze angel statue. Something still among the graves. Weathered by time into a dark, almost black patina that changes the way it looks depending on the light. In some angles, it feels protective. In others, it feels like it's watching, completely alone. And over the years, that silence around it became something people started filling with stories. That's how the legend of the Black Angel begins. At first, it was just rumors. Then, it became warnings. Then, it becomes something people repeat as if it's always been true. A belief that the statue is connected to death. That touching it brings bad luck. That kissing it brings death itself. And one of the most persistent claims, a superstition tied to pregnancy, passed quietly through local stories, never fully explained, but repeated often enough to linger. None of this comes from official records. It comes from people talking, remembering, and retelling until the line between fact and folklore starts to blur. The reality is simpler. The statue darkened over time due to natural oxidation. Bronze changes. Weather will leave its mark. Iowa's winters and years of exposure did what they always do to metal that stands outside long enough. But reality doesn't always matter once a story takes hold. Because even after the explanation exists, the feeling remains. And that's what makes this place feel different. Oakland Cemetery doesn't need the statue to be cursed for people to treat it like it is. The atmosphere does most of the work. The quiet paths, the rows of stones. The awareness that this is a place built around endings. And the more people talk about it, the stronger the idea becomes. Not because it's proven, but because it's repeated. That's how folklore survives here. Not through evidence, but through emotion. And the Black Angel becomes less about what it is and more about what people believe it could be. A symbol of grief that slowly absorbed a meaning it was never designed to carry. A place where fear doesn't come from something happening, but from the possibility that something might. And in the end, that's what keeps people away from it at night. Even if nothing is cursed, sometimes belief alone is enough to make people feel afraid. By the time you step back and look at everything together, one case in Iowa starts to sit at the center of almost every darker conversation. The Villisca Axe murder house. Not just as a crime, but as a question that never stopped echoing. This is where the conspiracy thread begins to form. The idea that this was the case that was never meant to be solved. Because the longer you looked at it, the more fractured it becomes. There are theories of a cover-up, that something local and powerful influenced what was released, or what was pursued. There are conflicting suspect stories that never quite align, shifting over time as new narratives replaced old ones. And then there's the simplest problem of all. There was never closure that felt complete. No conviction that settled the story. No final answer that fully quieted it. And when that happens, something else always fills the space. Speculation. Some versions of the theory point to a serial killer passing through the region, someone responsible for similar violence elsewhere, whose movements were never fully tracked. Others lean towards a traveling drifter narrative, someone who could have moved through a small town like Viscala in an era where records were thin and communication was slower. Then there are more abstract interpretations. The idea that evidence was lost, suppressed, or dismissed too quickly. That what was known at the time didn't survive intact into history. And in darker corners of discussion, the case gets symbolic. Reframed through occult interpretations or meaning, making attempts that can try to explain violence through pattern rather than randomness. None of these theories exist in isolation. They overlap, evolve, and compete with each other. Each generation adding its own layer of possibility on top of what came before. But the core of it never changes. An unanswered case becomes kind of an open space, and people rarely leave open spaces empty. Because the longer something sits unsolved, the more versions of the truth grow around it. When you pull all of it back, Iowa starts to feel different. Not because it's changed, but because you notice what was always there. The empty roads, the long fields, the small towns that don't look like much at first glance. Iowa doesn't shout its stories. It lets them sit quietly until you're alone enough to hear them. And when you do, you start to realize this state isn't empty at all. It's full of things that don't always make themselves obvious right away. A winged figure that vanished without explanation. A house that never stopped holding onto a single night. And a statue that becomes something more in people's minds than it ever really was in reality. Maybe it's all just history. Or maybe it's what happens when history doesn't fully stay buried. Either way, Iowa is still listening. And it still remembers. Next time on A through Z of Haunted America, we move forward into the next state, where the folklore gets even darker, and the stories start to feel a little too close to present to ignore. And as always, if you have a story you would like to share, you can submit your stories to hexes, haunts, and howls at gmail.com. Again, that's hexes, haunts, and howls, all one word, at gmail.com. Thank you for listening to Hexes, Haunts, and Howls. I'm your host, Cupcake. Until next time, stay sweet.